Here is the expanded script, doubled in length with additional details, examples, and depth, while maintaining the same continuous structure without repetition. In the spring of 1764, the British Parliament made what appeared to be a routine administrative decision about colonial currency that would inadvertently set in motion a chain of events leading directly to the loss of 13 American colonies and the birth of a new nation. And the remarkable thing about this decision was not its malicious intent, but rather its spectacular blindness to economic reality and its complete disregard for the practical consequences that would follow. The Currency Act of 1764, passed on April 19th and signed into law by King George III, with an effective date of September 1st of that year, prohibited the American colonies from issuing their own paper money as legal tender for both public and private debts, and required all financial obligations owed to British merchants and the Crown to be paid exclusively in British pounds sterling, a currency that was chronically scarce in the colonies and difficult for ordinary colonists to obtain in meaningful quantities. To understand why this seemingly technical regulation about monetary policy proved so catastrophic and why it generated such intense colonial resentment that it was later cited as one of the major grievances leading to revolution, we need to examine the peculiar economic situation that had developed in colonial America over the preceding decades, the various attempts by different colonies to solve their currency problems through local innovation, and why the British solution to what they perceived as a currency problem was not just impractical but economically devastating in ways that Parliament either failed to anticipate or simply dismissed as unimportant. The colonial economy operated under a fundamental structural imbalance that created what economists would recognize as a persistent shortage of hard currency, specifically gold and silver coins known as specie. And this shortage was not the result of colonial profligacy or mismanagement, but rather an inevitable consequence of the colony's position within the mercantilist British Empire and the patterns of trade that this system imposed. The American colonies had no gold or silver mines of their own and were forbidden by the Crown from minting their own coins, which meant that all specie had to be imported from abroad, primarily from Spanish America, through intricate trade networks that involved exchanging colonial products like fish, lumber, and provisions for Spanish silver coins that circulated widely in the Atlantic world. The problem was that the colonies ran a chronic and seemingly intractable trade deficit with Britain itself, importing far more manufactured goods from the mother country than they exported back in raw materials. And this fundamental imbalance meant that whatever specie the colonists managed to acquire through trade with the Caribbean sugar islands, the wine islands of the Atlantic, or through their occasional direct commerce with southern Europe, immediately flowed back to England to pay for British imports of cloth, tools, furniture, books, and the 1,000 other manufactured items that colonial economies could not produce themselves. Colonial merchants, planters, and government officials complained repeatedly and with increasing frustration that gold and silver arrived in their ports only to disappear almost immediately across the Atlantic, leaving the domestic economy starved for a medium of exchange and forcing people to resort to increasingly creative and sometimes inefficient methods of conducting commerce. A merchant in Philadelphia might receive Spanish silver dollars in payment for a shipment of flour to Jamaica, only to watch those same coins depart on the next ship to London to pay his account with a British textile manufacturer, leaving him once again without ready cash to pay local suppliers, purchase new inventory, or extend credit to customers. In the absence of sufficient coin to facilitate the growing volume of economic activity in the colonies, colonial commerce had developed sophisticated alternatives that included extensive use of book credit, where merchants maintained running accounts with customers that might be settled only once or twice a year, direct barter of goods and services where farmers might exchange bushels of wheat for blacksmithing services or barrels of rum, the use of commodity money such as tobacco warehouse receipts in the Chesapeake region that circulated almost like paper currency, and most importantly and most controversially, the issuance of paper bills of credit by colonial legislatures that filled the currency vacuum and allowed commerce to flow more smoothly. These paper currencies were not backed by gold or silver reserves in the manner of later banknotes, but rather by the taxing authority of the colonial governments themselves, making them a form of fiat money that derived value from the government's promise to accept them for tax payments and its commitment to eventually retire them from circulation through taxation. And when managed responsibly with careful attention to the balance between issuance and retirement, these paper currencies functioned quite well and facilitated genuine economic growth. Massachusetts had been the pioneer in this area, issuing the first colonial paper money in 1690 to finance its share of the costs from King William's War. And the innovation proved so useful that by 1715, 10 of the 13 colonies had resorted to the issuance of paper currency to address their chronic shortage of circulating medium. The great advantage of paper currency, as economist Stanley Finkelstein noted, was that unless it was backed by specie, it was essentially cost-free currency that governments could create by fiat to meet the needs of their economies without having to first accumulate precious metals through trade or taxation. The system worked reasonably well when colonies exercised restraint in printing money and maintained a rough balance between issuance and retirement through taxation. But several colonies, particularly in New England during the period of the French and Indian Wars, had succumbed to the temptation of printing far more paper money than they collected in taxes, leading to rapid depreciation of the currency and creating exactly the sort of inflationary spiral that gives fiat money a bad reputation among creditors and orthodox financial thinkers. By 1740, the situation had become dire in some colonies where Rhode Island's paper money had fallen to just 4% of its face value and Massachusetts' currency to 11%, which meant that British merchants who had extended credit to colonial buyers in good faith, expecting repayment in currency that maintained its value, found themselves being repaid in money worth a fraction of what they had originally lent, and they naturally felt cheated and defrauded even though the colonists were technically fulfilling their legal obligations. This situation understandably infuriated British creditors who lobbied Parliament vigorously for protection against what they characterised as colonial financial irresponsibility and effective theft through currency manipulation, and their complaints found sympathetic ears in a Parliament that was already concerned about maintaining effective control over increasingly prosperous and potentially autonomous colonies. The merchant community in London and other British port cities wielded considerable political influence, and they demanded action to protect their commercial interests from colonial currency depreciation, leading to the first Currency Act in 1751. Which restricted the 4 New England colonies specifically from issuing legal tender paper money and from establishing new public banks that might issue such currency. The 1751 Act was targeted and limited in scope, applying only to the New England colonies that had been the worst offenders in currency depreciation and leaving the other colonies free to continue their own currency experiments, subject only to the requirement that the British Crown approve such issuances. And this selective approach made a certain amount of sense because it addressed the specific problem without disrupting currency systems that were functioning adequately. The 1764 Currency Act was far more sweeping and indiscriminate in its reach, extending the prohibition on issuing legal tender paper money to all 13 colonies, regardless of their individual currency management records, their specific economic circumstances, or the degree to which they had or had not engaged in the excessive printing and depreciation that had prompted complaints from British merchants. The southern colonies, which had continued to issue large amounts of paper money to pay for the men and materiel necessary to fight the 7 Years' War, found themselves particularly targeted by the new restrictions, with Virginia having issued £20,000 worth of currency in 1755 alone, and additional sums in subsequent years to support the war effort. The timing of this expanded currency restriction was particularly unfortunate and politically tone-deaf because it came immediately after the conclusion of the French and Indian War, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, which had nearly doubled Britain's national debt from £75 million in 1756 to £133 million by 1763, with annual interest payments alone consuming over half the national budget and creating a genuine fiscal crisis that demanded new sources of revenue. The British government, facing the largest peacetime national debt in the nation's history and concerned about the costs of maintaining a standing army in North America to defend the newly won territories from France and to manage relations with Native American tribes on the frontier, looked to the American colonies to shoulder some of the financial burden of a war that had been fought partly in their defense, and for their benefit through the expulsion of French power from North America and the opening of the Ohio Valley to British settlement. Parliament's strategy for extracting revenue from the colonies involved a series of new taxes and regulatory measures, including the Sugar Act passed just weeks before the Currency Act. And these measures were designed to generate income while simultaneously tightening control over colonial trade, reducing smuggling that had become endemic during the war years when enforcement was lax, and asserting more direct parliamentary authority over colonial affairs in ways that would prove deeply controversial. The Currency Act fit into this broader strategy by serving the dual purpose of protecting British merchant interests from depreciated colonial currency, while also making it more difficult for colonies to finance their own activities independently of British oversight and reducing their capacity for autonomous action. What British policymakers catastrophically failed to grasp, despite warnings from some colonial agents and even from some British officials with actual experience in America, was that prohibiting colonial paper money while providing no substitute source of currency, no mechanism to address the underlying specie shortage, and no means for colonies to obtain sufficient British pounds sterling to conduct their ordinary commerce would not simply force colonists to use British pounds as Parliament apparently imagined, but would instead strangle colonial commerce, create immediate economic hardship across all 13 colonies, and generate intense political resentment that would fuel revolutionary sentiment. Colonial merchants found themselves in an impossible bind where they were required to pay British creditors in a currency they could not obtain in sufficient quantities, no matter how industrious or honest they might be. Their ability to conduct domestic trade was severely impaired by the lack of any medium of exchange to facilitate transactions. Their colonial governments lost the flexibility to respond to economic conditions or finance necessary public expenditures, such as road building or harbour improvements. And the entire elaborate structure of credit relationships that had allowed colonial economies to function despite the chronic shortage of specie threatened to collapse. The Act also contained punitive provisions in its third clause, stating that any colonial governor who disobeyed the Act or allowed others to disobey it would be charged a fine of £1,000 and permanently disbarred from government office, demonstrating Parliament's determination to enforce compliance regardless of local circumstances and effectively threatening colonial governors with financial ruin and career destruction if they showed any sympathy for colonial economic needs. The colonial response to the Currency Act revealed a level of anger and resentment that went far beyond mere economic inconvenience and tapped into fundamental questions about political autonomy, representation, the nature of the relationship between the colonies and the mother country, and ultimately about what it meant to be a British subject with rights that government should respect, rather than merely a subject of arbitrary power. Colonial merchants, legislators, and political leaders recognized the Currency Act not as an isolated technical regulation about monetary policy, but as part of a disturbing pattern of parliamentary assertions of authority over colonial affairs without colonial input, consultation, or consent. And this recognition sparked debates about the constitutional relationship between Parliament and the colonial assemblies that would eventually lead to revolutionary conclusions. The Act of 1764 announced in effect that colonists could no longer conduct global trade as they previously had, with the flexibility to adapt to local conditions and opportunities, that they could not print paper money to facilitate commerce, or pay debts even when such issuance was carefully managed and economically necessary, and that violations would be prosecuted in admiralty courts, without jury trials rather than in colonial courts, where local understanding of circumstances might produce more sympathetic verdicts, all of which struck at the heart of what colonists considered their rights as freeborn Englishmen who should not be subject to arbitrary power. Revolutionary leader James Otis wrote with characteristic passion that these measures were absolutely irreconcilable with the rights of the colonists as British subjects, and this language of rights violation rather than mere policy disagreement marked a significant escalation in colonial political consciousness and represented a shift from practical objections to constitutional principles. The Currency Act's economic impact was immediate, severe, and felt across all sectors of colonial society, particularly affecting merchants in northern seaports like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, who depended on complex triangular trade networks involving the Caribbean sugar islands, where they would exchange provisions, lumber, fish, and livestock for molasses, which was then distilled into rum in New England distilleries for export to Africa in exchange for slaves, to southern colonies in exchange for tobacco and rice, and back to the Caribbean in an intricate web of commerce that generated the specie and bills of exchange needed to purchase British manufactured goods and maintain colonial standards of living. By disrupting the currency system that lubricated this trade and made it possible for merchants to maintain the complex chains of credit that linked producers, shippers, retailers, and consumers across thousands of miles of ocean, the Currency Act threatened to collapse the entire economic structure that had allowed the colonies to prosper over the preceding decades, and to generate the purchasing power that made them such valuable markets for British exports. Colonial petitions and protests emphasized repeatedly and with increasing urgency that the currency restriction came at a moment when they were already suffering from a post-war economic depression brought on by the sudden end of wartime spending and demand, that the scarcity of circulating cash among them was acute and getting worse, and that the trade patterns which had provided them with means to pay for British goods were being simultaneously attacked by the Sugar Act's new duties on molasses and other goods that made the triangular trade less profitable and more difficult to sustain. A Virginia planter who had borrowed money to purchase slaves and clear new tobacco fields found himself unable to obtain the sterling currency needed to pay his London factor regardless of how many hogsheads of tobacco he shipped across the Atlantic, because the complex system of credit and colonial currency that had previously allowed such transactions to work smoothly was being dismantled without any replacement mechanism. What made the situation even more frustrating from the colonial perspective was that many colonies had managed their paper currencies responsibly over many years, without engaging in the excessive printing and depreciation that had prompted the original 1751 restrictions on New England, yet they found themselves collectively punished by a blanket prohibition that made no distinctions between responsible and irresponsible currency management, and treated all colonial governments as equally untrustworthy regardless of their actual track record. The Currency Act also revealed a deeper philosophical divide about the nature of colonial autonomy and the extent of parliamentary authority over internal colonial affairs, because currency issuance had been understood for decades as a domestic colonial matter where local assemblies acted within their legitimate sphere of self-governance in the same way that they managed other internal affairs like road building, court systems and local taxation, and Parliament's assertion of control over colonial currency represented an expansion of imperial power into areas that colonists believed were beyond Parliament's proper jurisdiction and violated the implicit constitutional settlement that had governed the empire. When the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in 1774 to coordinate colonial responses to British policies and to present a united front in defense of colonial rights, it issued a Declaration of Rights that explicitly called for the repeal of the Currency Act of 1764. Listing it among 7 acts labelled as subversive of American rights and demonstrating that the currency issue remained a significant grievance a full decade after its passage and had not been forgotten or forgiven despite being overshadowed in popular memory by later controversies. Benjamin Franklin, serving as colonial agent in London and testifying before Parliament about the sources of colonial discontent in the hope of finding some basis for reconciliation, identified the prohibition on making paper money as one of the primary causes of colonial anger and economic distress, explaining with his characteristic clarity that the colonies had used their paper currencies to facilitate economic development and commercial expansion, and that removing this tool without providing an adequate alternative had created genuine hardship for ordinary people trying to conduct their daily business. The Currency Act's role in the coming of the American Revolution was not as dramatically visible or easily understood by contemporaries as the Stamp Act's protests with their mob actions and dramatic resignations of stamp distributors, or the Boston Tea Party with its theatrical dumping of tea into the harbour, but it was in many ways more fundamentally corrosive to the colonial-imperial relationship because it struck at the practical economic foundations of colonial life, rather than being primarily a symbolic political grievance that could be addressed through repeal of a single tax. The Act demonstrated to colonists on a daily basis as they tried to conduct business, pay workers, purchase supplies or settle accounts that Parliament either did not understand or did not care about the economic realities of colonial commerce, that British merchant interests would be prioritised over colonial welfare regardless of the consequences for American livelihoods, and that the colonies would not be consulted about policies that directly affected their daily economic survival, even when such consultation might have produced better policy outcomes. From the British perspective in London, the Currency Act seemed like a reasonable and moderate protection for creditors against depreciated currency that had genuinely harmed British commercial interests, a necessary assertion of parliamentary control over colonial monetary policy to prevent financial chaos, and a way to ensure that the empire operated on a unified monetary system based on sterling that would facilitate commerce and strengthen imperial ties. From the colonial perspective in Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, and 100 smaller towns and villages across America, it appeared as an arbitrary restriction imposed by a distant legislature with no understanding of American conditions, no experience of the actual challenges of conducting commerce without adequate currency, and no mechanism for Americans to voice objections, propose alternatives, or influence policy in ways that might protect their legitimate interests. The Currency Act thus contributed to the revolutionary crisis not through a single dramatic confrontation that historians could point to as the moment when everything changed, but through the steady accumulation of resentment as colonists struggled daily with its practical consequences and drew larger conclusions about their political status within the British Empire and the prospects for justice within the existing constitutional framework. The prohibition on colonial currency also had the unintended effect of making the colonies more economically unified in their grievances, because the currency shortage and its accompanying hardships were felt across all regions and economic sectors, creating common ground between northern merchants who needed currency to finance their trade, southern planters who needed it to pay workers and purchase supplies, and frontier settlers who needed it simply to conduct the basic transactions of daily life. And this common grievance helped overcome the regional differences and economic rivalries that might otherwise have prevented unified colonial action. What Britain had carelessly done through the Currency Act was to take a functioning, if imperfect, economic system that had evolved organically over decades to address the peculiar circumstances of colonial commerce within a mercantilist empire and replace it with a system that could not work given the structural realities of colonial trade patterns, the chronic shortage of specie, and the absence of any mechanism to provide adequate British currency to the colonies, all while demonstrating through the manner of the Act's passage that colonial voices would not be heard in decisions that vitally affected colonial welfare. The Act was particularly damaging to the long-term relationship between Britain and its colonies because it was not presented as a temporary emergency measure to address a specific crisis that would be lifted once conditions improved, but as a permanent structural change to how colonial economies could operate with no sunset provision and no promise of reconsideration, and it offered no transition period during which colonies could adjust to the new system or alternative solution to the genuine problem of inadequate currency supply that Parliament acknowledged but refused to address. Colonial assemblies and merchants, desperate to find some compromise that might preserve both British commercial interests and colonial economic functionality, proposed numerous alternatives that might have addressed legitimate British concerns about currency depreciation while preserving colonial economic viability, such as allowing paper money backed by land banks with strict statutory limits on the total amount in circulation, or permitting paper money for payment of public debts to colonial governments while restricting its use for private transactions with British creditors, but Parliament showed no interest in compromise, negotiation, or any solution that would grant colonies even limited autonomy over their currency systems. The lesson colonists drew from this intransigence was profoundly disillusioning and politically radicalizing, namely that they would never be treated as partners in governance whose interests and expertise deserved consideration, but always as subordinates whose concerns could be sacrificed to British convenience and whose role was simply to obey whatever policies Parliament chose to impose. And this realization proved more revolutionary in its implications than any particular policy grievance because it called into question the fundamental legitimacy of parliamentary authority over people who had no representation in that body and no means to defend their interests within the British political system. By 1774, when tensions had escalated to the point where armed conflict seemed increasingly likely and both sides were hardening their positions, the Currency Act remained prominently on the list of colonial demands for repeal, indicating that it had not been forgotten or forgiven despite being overshadowed in the public imagination by later controversies like the Stamp Act crisis of 1765 and the Townshend Acts crisis that followed. And historians have noted that while the Currency Act may have become less of a live issue by that date due to partial amendments in 1770 and 1773 that provided some relief, its psychological impact in convincing colonists that Parliament did not understand or care about their problems remained powerful and influential in shaping revolutionary consciousness. The ultimate irony of the Currency Act was that British policymakers enacted it partly to maintain tighter control over the colonies, to ensure they remained profitable dependencies that contributed to rather than drained imperial resources, and to prevent colonial economies from developing too much autonomy that might eventually threaten British interests. But the economic disruption and political resentment it generated had precisely the opposite effect, by pushing colonists toward questioning the entire imperial relationship, and ultimately towards seeking complete independence as the only way to secure their economic interests and political rights. Had Parliament approached the genuine problem of currency depreciation with more nuance, more willingness to distinguish between colonies that had managed their currencies responsibly and those that had not, perhaps restricting only those colonies that had actually engaged in excessive printing while allowing responsible currency management to continue under appropriate safeguards, or had they coupled necessary restrictions with positive measures to increase the supply of specie in the colonies through imperial banking institutions or guaranteed currency deliveries, the outcome might have been very different, and the Act might have been accepted as a reasonable imperial regulation rather than resented as an intolerable imposition. Instead, the Currency Act of 1764 stands as a textbook example of how imperial powers can carelessly spark revolution, not through calculated oppression or deliberate tyranny, but through tone-deaf policy that ignores economic reality, dismisses local knowledge and expertise, fails to consider the practical consequences of theoretical solutions, and signals fundamental disrespect for the autonomy and intelligence of subject populations who are expected to simply accept whatever decisions distant authorities make about their lives. And in this sense, Britain did not maliciously provoke rebellion, but rather stumbled into it through a combination of fiscal desperation following an expensive war, merchant lobbying from creditors who had legitimate grievances but whose proposed solution created worse problems than it solved, and administrative arrogance that saw complex colonial economies with their particular circumstances and adaptive solutions as simple problems to be solved through parliamentary fiat. The path from the Currency Act to the confrontations at Lexington and Concord 11 years later was neither straight nor inevitable, and many other factors contributed to the eventual breakdown of the imperial relationship. But the Act's contribution to that journey was significant, precisely because it affected colonists' daily economic lives in tangible ways that abstract political principles could not, demonstrated Parliament's willingness to impose impractical and even destructive policies without colonial consent or even consultation, and revealed that the imperial relationship had fundamentally changed from the earlier pattern of benign neglect, where colonies largely managed their own affairs within a loose imperial framework, to a new pattern of extraction and control, where Parliament actively intervened in colonial affairs to serve British interests regardless of colonial consequences, and once colonists understood that change and recognised that the old informal constitutional settlement was dead, the question became not whether to resist, but only what form that resistance would ultimately take, and whether accommodation within the empire remained possible or whether independence offered the only path to security and self-determination.